welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those who are joining the program for the first time, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today is Dr. Salvatore Mercogliano. He's an associate professor of history at Campbell University, North Carolina, and an adjunct professor at the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. The topic we're discussing today is an angle we don't hear much about. This is we're talking about the angle of the shipping industry, their outlook after the series of disruptions by Houthis and Iran in the Red Sea and increasingly the Indian Ocean and surrounding areas, the Gulf of Oman and so forth. We know that the shipping costs have skyrocketed. We know that there's been other security incidents, such as attacks by Somali pirates, which and hijackings of oil tankers, which have had the impact on oil and gas prices, particularly in the countries such as the Far East, impacted by their dependence on imports from abroad. But what we don't know is what exactly we are looking at, how and why these prices affect these industries in particular way, and what we can expect from the shipping industry, from the insurance companies, and from other industrial elements taking part in this very important supply chain down the road, especially if the conflict continues. And Dr. Mercogliano will shed light on these developments. Thank you so much for joining the show. Please tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and your involvement in this area before we start.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me on, Arena. I appreciate that and that kind introduction. As you mentioned, I teach history down at Campbell University in North Carolina. But before that, I was a merchant mariner. I sailed ships for a living. I worked ashore. So I've done it both on the deck plate and in the kind of headquarters side. I decided to become a maritime historian, kind of got out of shipping. I focus on the history of shipping, but I've also become much more involved in the teaching of industry policy. So I teach courses on maritime industry policy. I do courses on maritime security and maritime supply chain and business. I've been working with Captain, which is an online kind of maritime journal. I've been writing for them for years now. I do about an article a month or so for them. And then back in March of 2021, I was asked to do some kind of expert witnesses and testimony on some news channels regarding the grounding of the motor vessel Ever Given in the Suez. And that led me to start my YouTube channel, What's Going On with Shipping. It was very small when it started. It's got kind of gotten a little bigger now. Got about 180,000 subscribers, and do several videos a week on global shipping. Obviously, the focus recently has been on what's going on in and around the Red Sea.
Well, let's start with history then. History of how insurance and how shipping industry responds to crisis, to global crisis, to supply chain disruptions. What has been the experience with these issues before these current events? What have been the major conflicts in modern, relatively contemporary history that have caused long-term or short-term disruptions and issues?
Sure. So, I mean, insurance is akin to shipping. It goes hand in hand. Lloyd's of London, which was a coffee house, was a place where ship owners would go and wait for the arrival of their ships, and they began to bet on whether or not the ships would arrive. And if you were a ship owner, you would actually bet against your ship because if your ship came in, you would profit from it. But if your ship didn't come in, at least you won the bet. That's kind of the birth of modern insurance, if you think about it. And what we've seen happen is ships operate on two types of insurance. They have insurance for the ship, what's called hull and machinery, and then they have something for the cargo. It's called P&I, protection and indemnity. And what's happening right now in and around the Red Sea is you have to add an extra bit of insurance on it called war risk insurance. Your normal insurance covers everyday affairs and all the kind of potential dangers that happens. Very similar to owning a home. You own a home, you have your homeowner's insurance. You have your insurance for that. However, if you get hit by a flood or something that's not in your policy, you need to have a separate policy for that. And if you don't, you're out of luck. Well, same thing for war. If you sail into a war zone, which is declared by a group, then you need to have this war risk insurance. And what you're paying basically is a percentage of the value of the ship and the cargo. And what we saw happen here in and around the Red Sea was that value has increased. Now we've seen this happen before in past wars. Go back to World War I, World War II. You can really track how effective nations are at getting cargo across based on their war risk. When German U-boats were in full force in World War I, World War II, you could see the insurance rates climb. And then when they're able to be suppressed, they go back down. Same thing going back to the Civil War, to the Napoleonic Wars. You can really track the success of navies in protecting commercial shipping. What we're seeing right now in and around the Red Sea was prior to the attack of the Houthi against the ship called the Galaxy Leader. This was the very dramatic helicopter attack onto a ship where they boarded the vessel and then hijacked the vessel. Insurance rates were extremely low for war risk, maybe 0.02%, which is, it's several $1,000s you were paying for a ship to sail through this region. So it was very minimal. But what we've seen is the insurance rates have continued to rise, and they got up to 0.7%. Now they're at almost 1%, which doesn't sound like a lot. But if you have a container ship, and these container ships are the way we move cargo around the world, these are those modular boxes that you put on ships. An average container can have about $5,000 to $10,000 worth of cargo. So a container ship could be worth 100 million to $250 million. So you're talking about war risk of $1 to $2.5 million.
Now, let's talk about another element here, which is how exactly uh, is the determination that something has become a war zone made? Is it based on the U.S. State Department or some international comments or statements? Is it based on the number of incidents?
Well, it's actually determined by insurance companies. And so this is where you get into a very weird area where marine insurance is handled by a kind of a very finite group of insurance companies. These are what are called clubs. And there's an association put together by these clubs that determine where war risk exists in and around the area. They do that in conjunction with the United Nations International Maritime Organization. So you would establish areas that have war zones. So, for example, in and around the Black Sea, that area has been a declared war zone for quite a while. And what we saw in the Black Sea, for example, is when that area was declared a war zone, you needed to get this additional coverage for that area. And so war zone insurance coverage up in the Black Sea, for example, got as high as 2.5 to 3%. It's much lower now. It's actually down, actually less than what we're seeing in the Red Sea right now. But we've seen this where areas are determined, and again, it's really the insurance companies. It is the shipping companies and consulting with these insurance companies that really working
Mhm.
with the International Maritime Organization to identify areas of high risk. Because if you're a shipping company too, you don't want to lose a ship. You don't want your ship to be damaged and not be
Mhm.
able to cover it. So a lot of the times they're working together to really formulate areas where they see concern, and that's what's happened here. Once you have the Israeli-Gaza conflict happen, and the fear is that was going to spill out beyond the borders there.
Mhm.
Those areas in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Suez Canal, and all the way down the Red Sea to what's called the Bab el-Mandab. This is the strait at the very bottom end of the Red Sea into the Gulf of Aden. All that area has been declared a war zone. And so shipping companies to sail through that area have to get war risk, or else they risk losing the ship and not having coverage for it. They can do that, but it's extremely risky. It puts a lot of liability on shipping companies. And what shipping companies will never do is expose themselves to liability or to the chance of losing profits.
That makes total sense. But at what point is this determination made? What factors are being considered that something is a long-term problem rather than an isolated series of incidents that ends quickly? In Israel's case, there was a formal declaration of war, but then again, nobody really knows how long the operations would proceed. So,
Well, that's a big issue going on currently because one of the things that we've seen is the United States Navy, along with other navies, have launched this operation called Operation Prosperity Guardian, which
Hmm.
is meant to provide defense. And one of the things that the U.S. Navy was hoping to provide is enough defense to get that war risk insurance lowered so that these shipping companies will come back. The big shipping companies, the big container liners, have basically pulled out because the risk is too great. Their ships are too valuable. These are very large ships. 12% of the global trade goes through this area. And the container ships you see go through here are some of the biggest. We're talking about 20 to 24,000 container ships, box ships going through. And so they're extremely expensive. And so they've pulled out. And one of the things that they're hoping to do is the Navy, in conjunction with these insurance companies, able to negotiate a new insurance rate that the ships will be willing to go through. What the companies are doing right now is doing the cost benefit analysis. They're looking at how much it costs in fuel and extra cost to go around Africa. That's a voyage of an additional 3,500 miles versus going through the Red Sea, through the Suez Canal. And that becomes the cost benefit analysis. So insurance companies working with shipping companies, working with the military are all trying to determine whether or not it has been, the reduction has happened. And what we've seen recently is a series of strikes by the United States and the United Kingdom against the Houthi. And what has actually happened is the insurance has gone up because even though there are less missiles being launched by the Houthi, the fear is that you may see a vessel get lost. And that's the worst fear, is the loss of the crew and loss of the cargo. Damage is one thing, but loss of a ship is a whole other one. And you have the financial loss, but then you also have the environmental damage that could be done in and around this area.
So let's go back a couple of years ago when Iran started this habit of hijacking oil tankers, and that lasted for, a short period, and then it was put to an end by by a combination of US actions. Let me leave it at that. So, how was that period of time where it was rather uncertain what was going to happen and how long it was last different from the current situation? Did you see the same spike, or was there a spike at all? And
Yeah, matter of fact, if you go back even further, if you go back to the 1980s when Iran
Mhm.
and Iraq were involved in a very brutal war, over 1 million dead, very brutal. There was a kind of a side note to that was the tanker war, where Iran and Iraq began to target ships in and around the Persian Gulf, largely around the Karg Island area and around Iraq's facilities up in Qasir. And these attacks got really nasty over time. They escalated over the years until you got to the point where about 450 tankers were hit, and insurance rates escalated tremendously, about 7%. It was really the highest we've ever seen, short of a full world war. And eventually, this led to Kuwait asking the United States Navy to escort its ships. This involved reflagging the vessels to the United States registry, and the U.S. got involved in a very elaborate convoy operation. What you're talking about that's happened recently over in the 2010s into the 2020s have been seizures by Iran of tankers. And what Iran has done is very interesting is they have basically filed lawsuits against these vessels in Iranian court. And under admiralty law, you can physically arrest a vessel. You can actually vessels act like human beings in admiralty law, and so, like, if you owe me money, I can sue you in court. But it's almost the same thing as, well, I'm going to sue your house because your house has wealth, your house has a value to it, and so you can sue a ship for fees and whatever's due. And what Iran has tried to do is, under the guise of maritime law, made this argument. And so, for example, a ship they just seized not the other day, a ship called the St. Nicholas, was a ship that the United States had seized. It basically had the ship's company divert that vessel all the way to Houston, Texas from Malaysia, and offloaded the oil because it was sanctioned Iranian oil. Well, the Iranians seized that ship when it was coming out of the Persian Gulf with Iraqi oil bound for Turkey, and now they've seized it. And so Iran has been involved in these kind of tit for tat kind of operations where they grab a ship, hold it, they'll offload the vessel. They're still holding some ships they've seized earlier in 2023, two vessels, as a matter of fact. So we've seen these operations happen. We've also seen Iran do attacks against ships with drones, with mines, very, very visible in 2019, 2020. And that led to an increase in the insurance costs. But again, those increases in the insurance costs were not enough to deter tankers from going through. Even the attacks we're seeing right now in the Red Sea are pretty infrequent. I mean, you're talking about thousands of ships going through this region since this all started, and the number of attacks, direct hits on ships is maybe a dozen. So so the profitability is always going to be what they're weighing. The other issue with the Persian Gulf is it's a cul-de-sac. There's one way in, one way out. So you have to go through it. There's no alternative. So you have to take that risk if you want to go in and get the Saudi and the Bahraini and the Qatar and the Iranian and the Iraqi oil. Uh, with the Bab el Mandab, this strait at the very bottom end of the Red Sea, if you don't want to go through there, you can go around Africa, and that's what's happening. So there's an alternative. The Straits of Hormuz has no alternative. There's no way to get the oil out. There's no pipeline big enough to get it out without using tankers.
So how exactly is the rise in insurance calculated in terms of the actual financials placed on it? Is there a specific rate, or is it just determined by the calculated risk in each individual instance?
Yeah, you have these insurance groups, these reinsurers, as they're known, who come together with this formula. And I am not an insurance expert by any means. And they come up with a formula whereby they determine what is, the chance of this happening versus the number of ships going through. And therefore, they pool their money together so that if there is a loss, they will be able to be able to pay off on it. That's their basic formula for doing this. The problem that's happening right now that's really causing the war risk insurance to begin to climb a lot is because more and more ships are pulling out of this route. You have to make higher rates because if something happens to a ship that does go through the area. And it's very similar to, determining insurance rates for driving cars for younger people versus older people. There's a lot more older people driving, they're a lot safer, so the insurance rates can be lower. The younger ones are much more at risk, so you raise it up for paying that off. And so these insurance companies have to really calculate. One of the most interesting developments that we're seeing right now is that the lead group in this insurance group, there's about three or four major insurance companies that do this, but the lead one is now saying that they may no longer offer insurance for US and UK owned ships because they are too dangerous because the Houthi now are targeting those ships specifically. The Houthi came out initially and said, okay, we're just going to target Israeli owned, Israeli flagships. Well, the Israelis sent their ships around the other way. Then they started targeting ships, they said, that are doing any business with Israel. And in truth, what the Houthis started hitting was ships that had nothing to do with Israel. They were just hitting ships. And that created a lot of uncertainty and risk. Now, following the strikes by the United States and the United Kingdom, what we're seeing is much more targeted attacks against US and UK owned ships.
So what happens if US and UK owned ships lose access to insurance? Are they forced to essentially hire other flag ships to carry the products, oil and gas and whatever for them?
Well, they're going to have to, if they can't be insured through that area, there's a couple of options. Number one, the United States and the United Kingdom can underwrite the insurance. This is something that we saw happen in the Black Sea when Ukraine announced they would help underwrite war risk insurance for ships that are coming up to Odessa and some of the other ports after the end of the Black Sea grain initiative. That typically happens in wartime. You saw that in World War One, World War Two, where nations underwrote their war risk insurance. You still had a private company that did it, but the U.S. government would come in and say, "Okay, we'll cover this element if you can't afford to." So that element is out there. We haven't seen it develop yet. This is what we're waiting to see, whether or not the US and the UK companies. What's interesting to see is they're hitting these bulk ships, these very large ships that carry grain and ore right now. And they tend to be very low value vessels, lower value than the container ships, still tens of millions of dollars, but not as high value as the ships we see. So the insurance cost hasn't been that great on them. Now we're seeing much more direct attacks on them, and that's going to raise the cost. And what's going to be really interesting is if the US and UK ships can't get insurance and you see all US, UK owned ships leave, but at the same time, the US Navy and the Royal Navy are the ones providing protection in the area. So what you would literally have is a scenario where there's no US, UK ships sailing through, but the US Navy and the UK Navy are providing security for ships that are largely hauling Russian oil, Iranian oil, and Chinese products. So it's a really strange and developments we're seeing right now, and I'm not exactly sure how the U.S. military and the U.S. foreign policy is going to react to that.
There is already some pushback against U.S. airstrikes, but I think U.S. itself has been trying to crack down on this, sale of oils, over the this transportation of Russian and Iranian oil and so forth. So I'm really not sure how they can handle it. They can't just let private ships get attacked and people, get abducted. But on the other hand, you don't want to end up, putting out resources protecting enemy products that are largely sanctioned.
Right. And this issue is becoming much more multifaceted because again, whereas, previously the attacks were happening in the southern Red Sea after the strikes by the United States and the United Kingdom in early January, now we're seeing strikes out into the Gulf of Aden. This is the very southern part of Yemen. The Houthi are located in the very western part of Yemen, right up along the Red Sea. But because of the type of weaponry they're getting from Iran, and we know that because there was a U.S. Navy mission to seize weapons heading into Houthi territory, these type of weapons can be launched over longer distances. They use ballistic missiles, very high trajectory arcs, and so now they're hitting ships in the Gulf of Aden. Plus, Iran has moved the ship from the Red Sea into the Gulf of Aden, and they're providing basically spotting information. So intelligence is being fed to the Houthi from the Iranian ships that are in the area, and then you have again, you have Somalis who are attacking ships. We've seen three ships attacked by Somalis. One of them has been captured and is in Somali waters. This is not the Somali piracy of the 2010s, where a couple of guys in a boat come out and they grab a vessel, sail it into Somali waters, and then hold the ship hostage. These are Somalis in league with the Houthi, and they're basically seizing ships, holding them. They're not asking for ransom because that was always the key. That was the issue before. It's like we need ransom. They don't want ransom. What they want to do is just hold the ships and cause a disruption. And then at the same time, you're seeing Iran directly attacking ships. We've seen two ships so far attacked up in the Gulf of in the Arabian Sea, up in the northern part of the Indian Ocean, and this has led to the intervention by the Indian Navy, and now the Pakistani Navy is out there with
Mhm.
strikes being launched by Iran against Pakistan. So. It's really amazing. The geopolitical situation in the region is really breaking down on multiple levels, and international shipping is kind of caught in the middle here because there's so much trade that goes between Europe and Asia, and a lot of that trade, about 30% of it goes on toward America, North America, US, Canada, Mexico, and then the Persian Gulf with all the fuel coming out that's necessary for Europe and Asia to keep running. So it is multifaceted, the issues we're seeing.
So now that Iran has directly expanded the conflict into areas beyond the Red Sea, such as the attack on that tanker near India, which, from what I understand, has suffered some damage, uh, is it fair to say that the insurance rates and shipping costs will also expand beyond that particular area, and this area of war risk will also be expanded to
Yeah,
other countries?
the
Mhm.
area of war risk we're seeing that's largely being is in the southern Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden, but we have a war risk area in and around the Persian Gulf, the Straits of Hormuz. That's been around for a while, so but it's been pretty minimal. But again, the attacks we're seeing right now are beginning to spread, and as they go out further distances, you expand the area that you need it. So, if you sail through an area right now, the war risk zone is identified for about a 7-day transit. If you go through the area, this is the area of coverage you need. But now you may need to cover more and more areas. And Iran is playing a very unique game here because they're launching these drones from shoreside. They're attacking vessels. Iran is also completing the conversion of two container ships into drone carriers, which means that they can sail these ships out into the ocean somewhere and conceivably launch these styles of attack from these vessels and reach out even further. And again, what this means is we're seeing the disruption of the global supply chain by initially the Houthi, who are Iranian backed, but now potentially also the Iranians doing it. And this puts the Iranians in control of two key maritime choke points, the Straits of Hormuz and the southern Red Sea. That's pretty important because a lot of trade goes through this area, including a lot of energy.
So that now there's also another element because there was a particular description of Iran's effort to occupy a number of Yemeni islands that essentially would block a major U.S. warship from leaving, exiting the area. Can you see a scenario where Iran, with in combination with its various proxies, mercenaries, and regional allies, could expand this level of territorial control to further narrow the path for U.S. or literally any other ships in the area, and to further disrupt supply chain in that way?
Yeah, I mean, what we're seeing right now is in the southern Red Sea and out in the Gulf of Aden, Iran has operated these base ships, these basically ships that go out there and just kind of sit there, and they provide this monitoring. Ships have something called an automatic identification system, so they kind of show up on these tracking systems. But a lot of ships going through the area, especially high value ships, will turn the targets off. But the Iranians have been providing data on that. These islands in and around, there's these very small little islands at the southern end of the Red Sea, at the very gate at the Bab el Mandab into the Gulf of Aden, and in and around Hormuz provide a lot of access. If you're on there, you can provide monitoring. You don't have to keep a ship there. You can put missiles and a whole variety of different weaponry on there. There was a discussion about the U.S. maybe instead of using their ships to guard to land Marines and put them on these islands off the coast of Yemen and provide this screen. The U.S. military decided not to do that. They don't want to put boots on the ground at all, even though these islands are largely uninhabited. But Iran is expanding its influence. It is not just a Persian Gulf power. It's a regional power, and they're doing a lot to expand their reach far beyond what we used to see them. We're kind of used to the Iranian Navy, these little speedboats harassing vessels going in and out. Now they're converting ships. They're operating for long distances from sea. We saw, for example, the Iranians sail a task force all the way to Venezuela and back a few years ago. So they're definitely having a much bigger reach than what we've seen before. And especially if they can use client states like the Houthi, these kind of agents, let them be the cannon fodder here and be the ones who are attacking. Iran's going to sit there and say it's not us, it's the Houthi. We're supporting them, but U.S. supports many allies around the world, and so they're basically becoming a big regional player. And the other player here is China. Let's not forget, China had just brokered a deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and China has been able to sail ships through this region pretty much without a problem. What they do is they just identify their ships as Chinese on these transponders. They announced their Chinese owned, Chinese flagged, or Chinese crew on board. And that seems like better protection than what the U.S. Navy is affording because the Houthi are pretty much not extensively. There's been a couple of Chinese ships hit, but I'm not sure it was purposely targeted. But most Chinese ships now can get through this area pretty good. Same thing with Russian tankers moving Russian crude oil for the dark fleet.
So does that affect the insurance rate for these specific types of ships with Russian or Chinese elements?
Well, one of the things has been an offshoot of what happened in Russia and Ukraine is that you saw the emergence of this dark fleet. This is, about a tenth of the world tanker fleet. There's about 4,000 tankers in the world's fleet, so about 400 to 600 ships are in this dark fleet, and what they're doing is they're operating moving Russian oil. And the G7 and the EU tried to limit that, and the way they did it was insurance. Basically, they basically used insurance as their tool. They basically got the big insurance companies together, the 13 big insurance companies, and they said, okay, don't insure these vessels if you're moving oil over a certain level. It was $60 for crude oil, $100 for diesel. And the idea was, well, you can't move ships without insurance. So if you don't have the insurance, the ships won't be able to sail. And what the EU and G7 wanted was they wanted to keep Russian oil flowing. They didn't want to cut it off because that would cause inflation and a lot of displacement of energy around the world. But at the same time, they wanted to hurt the Russians. So they wanted to make Russia have to sell their oil and diesel cheaper. Well, what has happened is these new insurance companies have popped up outside the main ones. So in the
Mhm.
UAE, in the Persian Gulf, in India, in South China and East China, we're seeing new insurance companies pop up, and they're providing the insurance for these companies. And these ships are operating not like normal ships. They're picking up oil in from tankers coming out of the Black Sea and the Baltic. They're at anchorages off Spain and Greece. They load this oil in what's called a ship to ship transfer. These little ships come alongside these bigger ships. These bigger ships then sail to regions, they offload that oil to smaller tankers and they go ashore. And they never touch land, which means they're never really inspected. They're kind of kept outside the norm. And so this is why we talk about a dark fleet, because they're operating outside the norm. And so they're operating with these new insurance companies, these new registry. Like a lot of these ships are being flagged in the nation of Gabon. Gabon is not a huge maritime nation. It's a
Oh,
nation where if you pay them money, they're going to give you allow you to fly their flag, and you're good to go. And and what we're seeing is we're seeing problems with this too, because we've seen, there was a big explosion on one of these ships off the coast of Malaysia, a ship called the Pablo last year, killed some of the crew. Because the ships aren't being well maintained, they're not
mhm.
being well taken care of, and they're operating with these kind of very kind of sketchy insurance companies. We're not exactly sure if something happens, they'll be able to pay off. But these are also very low value ships. These are ships that were destined to be scrapped, so they're really bottom. It's kind of like running a junker car and you go to this kind of fly by night insurance company to get insurance because you can't get insurance from anybody else. And that's what we're seeing happening. The problem is it's going to cause a problem eventually, because one of these ships are going to get hit. There's going to be an environmental damage, and there's going to be no money for the cleanup or to fix the problem.
We've actually seen something like that happen with the FSO Safer some years ago, and it's been an years long disaster until the UN came up with the solution. I'm not sure if it was fully implemented or not, but that
They
was
they offloaded. Matter of fact, they offloaded Safer. They completed that offload, and they were in the process of removing the vessel for scrapping. But again, it's a perfect example, because again, this is the danger. Is that was seen as such a potential environmental damage, because the Red Sea is kind of like a lake. If something happens in there and the ship gets hit or sunk, that damage is going to stay there. So this is one of the reasons why you really need the war risk insurance on these vessels, because you have to cover not just the loss of the ship and the cargo, but the cleanup and the environmental issues. And again, nobody knows how costly that can be in an area like the Red Sea, which is a very environmentally kind of a cloistered area, and especially for fishermen in the area. It would be a tremendous loss if you lose a ship in that area.
so. What has been the impact of this newer insurance companies on this insurance club structure and this essential all these economic and political arrangements and the general basically big picture? What is there a relationship between two? How do they negotiate among themselves, and or is there a potential for a war of insurance companies?
Well, the big insurance companies are big, and they handle 85% of or so
Hmm.
of most of the shipping insurance that's around the world. They're not really worried about a lot of competition, but it does mark the beginning of competition, and so there is going to see the emergence of some rival insurance companies outside the norm. If you look at the big 13 P&I clubs, they're very it's England, it's United States, it's Germany, it's all the kind of who's who have been insurance companies forever. Now all of a sudden you're seeing these new upstarts come in, and the danger is, one of the things to remember, Arena, is one of the things we got out of World War II was really the creation of these big open seas. Freedom of the seas was created, and it didn't really matter where you registered your ship. It didn't matter if you were a US or a British ship or a Japanese. You can be Marshall Islands, Liberia. It didn't matter, because the oceans were open. You didn't have to worry about protection. You can sail whatever you want. And that's been really good for the world, because what we've done is driven down the cost to move goods around. Now, it's been detrimental to some countries' economic sectors in some areas, because what has happened is if you eliminate transportation costs, then if you're producing steel in this country where there's almost it costs almost nothing, then it's going to drive down steel production in your country, which we've seen happen in the United States. The issue we're seeing now is that you may start creating, instead of one world kind of or I wouldn't say one world, but a global economic system that handles shipping, because shipping goes from place to place. It's got to be able to operate, and we've got rules in place now that if you sail into my port in the United States, the U.S. Coast Guard can go on any vessel and inspect it to make sure it's meeting global standards. So you can't operate a ship anymore that the lifeboats don't work, or because you have to meet that global standard. If you come in, the Coast Guard's going to nail you, and they're not going to let you sail till you fix it. But now what we're seeing potentially is the creation of a new subsystem where maybe there's a world fleet that's operating outside the norm. That's very akin to what we saw pre-World War II, pre-World Wars, where you were operating under national flags, but maybe now those national flags aren't the big nations, but they're nations like Gabon and in a few other countries where there's very minimal rules, very minimal regulations. The crews are treated terribly, and there's a potential for disaster. The shipping industry has gotten extremely safe, believe it or not. Even though we see a lot of issues today in the shipping industry, I think it's because our ability to see news is a lot better than before. It's much safer. Less ships are being sunk, less are being damaged
Mhm.
than ever before. But the fear I have is that you start creating these parallel systems, and this new system is going to be cheaper, it's going to work dirtier than the other one, and it's going to lead you to problems.
So I have two questions related to that. The first, if we are seeing something like that emerge in different spheres, Russia and Iran are developing their own version of SWIFT to circumvent sanctions. BRICS and assorted countries have been trying to establish their own currency exchanges, essentially, to de-dollarize, with very mixed results. Not quite successful in terms of completely undermining the dollar, but some nations came to these private arrangements. And there's also a number of efforts to create separate telecommunication systems and a lot of these things. Do you see these parallel systems driven by these polarized global interests? And some describe it as the new Cold War or some version of that. Do you see that leading to deglobalization?
Well, I mean, when you look at the original Cold War, one of the things we tend to focus on is the military system. But if you look at the economic systems, they were completely separate. The U.S. and the Soviet Union operated in different economic systems. Sometimes they overlap, but not too much. What we saw happen post Cold War is the integration of economic systems. Economic systems were integrated together. You create this kind of really kind of holistic kind of economy where trading is going on. Russia, China, everybody's trading together. Well, BRICS is a really interesting analogy because if you look at where shipping is going now, if you look at a map of ships where they are, well, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, man, that's where they're all going, especially if we're routing around the Red Sea. So, they're really astride all this key transportation routes. India is developing massive ports. They want to get involved in this. One of the reasons we saw a big response by the Indian Navy is because they don't want any challenges to their shipping. India provides a good chunk of the crews out there, along with China. So there's a lot of elements here for that potentially to happen. And again, if you start creating parallel shipping systems, that's going to be a problem because one of the things we've talked about is doing this. A lot of countries are talking about revitalizing national fleets, the US, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Kenya, India. A lot of countries are sitting there going, well, maybe we can't be 100% dependent on these ships that don't, that are tied to corporations and not to nationalities. One of the things that's really important to see here is that this whole issue was started by Maersk, one of the biggest shipping companies in the world, announced we're pulling out of the Red Sea, and they did it along with Hauppauge, a company they just announced an alliance with. And in truth, in some ways, these corporations, these shipping companies, which control 85% of all the trade around the world, have a lot of power. And they have not just economic power, they have political power, they have financial power, they have, in some ways, military power. They're leading to a military response in this area. And so if you're BRICS and you're looking at this and you're looking at the development here, there are cracks in the global shipping system that you can take advantage of. I can move insurance over to my area. I can move registry over to my area. Look where ships are being built: China, Japan, and Korea. Where are ships being scrapped? India, Bangladesh, Pakistan. There are opportunities out there to get portions of the shipping industry out of the clutches of what has been the traditional headquarters: New York, London, Amsterdam, Berlin. Now you can move it to other countries, and that's what's trying. We're seeing that happening.
So would it be fair to say that some of the countries that tend to benefit from this sort of economic impact of shipping disruption and supply chain disruption, that at the very least, it's not only Iran and the Houthis who benefit for their own, agenda for what it's worth, but these countries and these interests are likely to align, to provide assistance, and to basically increase the opportunity to benefit. In other words, are we seeing these shadow interests kind of swooping on this opportunity and trying to essentially move, destructure US and Western kind of, I wouldn't say monopoly, but hold and essentially backing of these industries? Aren't we seeing a shift away from the West and to the advantage of various countries, not all of whom are necessarily beneficent in the
No, no, I think you are. I mean, you're seeing, one of the things that I've been talking about on my channel is you'll hear these container companies come out and say, "Man, this is bad. We got to fix this. This is terrible for us." But in truth, they're benefiting tremendously, profit wise. They're making more money when they have to charge more to go these longer routes. They're making a percentage off the cost. So if costs go up, they make more. And same thing with these countries. There's a lot of countries that see opportunities here. Russia, for example, sees a great opportunity here to push their Northern Sea route. This is the route north of Russia, through the Arctic. They're sitting there going, "Hey, you want to avoid all this problem? Come north. Go through the Bering Sea. Come north. We'll use Russian icebreakers. We'll use Russian pilots, and you can come north. It's shorter than going through the Suez, and it's much safer to do it." The problem Russia always has is these accidents seem to happen during the height of winter. So it just, back in 2021 in March, it was ever given, and now it's winter time. So it just they really have a hard time really capitalizing on this. But for a country like South Africa, for example, it's a huge boom. Ships are coming to South Africa in huge numbers. The problem is South Africa has its own problems in dealing with this. They have problems in their ports. There's government problems in South Africa. The logistics and the infrastructure aren't quite there to support this. But for countries like Brazil, for example, which do a lot of trade, massive amounts of trade, they already had a lot of ships coming in, moving ore and grain and everything they need out. So there are opportunities there. India, in particularly, is trying to once again reassert itself in the Indian Ocean. The reason the Indians are building a huge navy is because they have a maritime influence. They know this. They're becoming a big trading element. And one of the countries that's suffering the most here is India, because Indian trade to Europe and America goes right through the Red Sea. It's the shortest distance, and this is an economic problem for them right now. So they need to fix that. And of course, China's always China. China is always looking at redundancy. They're always looking at what can we do to shore up our imports, exports, and do we have redundant routes? And that's Belt and Road. That's either rail lines across Asia, that's shipping routes. There's very few companies right now that are sailing through the Red Sea. One of them is a French company because the French Navy is providing direct protection for French ships going through. The other one is China. And again, China doesn't have to defend its ships. All it has to do is pop up that it's Chinese owned, and the ship is safe to go through. The Houthi really aren't dealing with them for good reasons. They don't want to lose Chinese support. And so, yeah, I do see, when you start talking about breaking down the global economic system, nations in the BRICS and other entities have an opportunity here to take advantage of this.
So, well, I'm going to ask you a question about the Arctic, and then I want to ask a kind of a bigger, a little bit provocative question regarding, the costs and benefits of all of this. So, regarding the Arctic, you made a very good point about Russia's efforts to turn the northern route to its advantage, and we've been hearing a little bit about it. But the Arctic and this route could work other ways because Russia does not have the monopoly on the Arctic, and in fact, there's quite a bit of global tensions over control of territory there. So
Oh,
how do you think other countries A could respond to Russia potentially taking advantage of that, and B, could they actually turn it to their own advantage? US, Norway, Canada, and so forth.
there is. I mean, the Northeast Passage, which is the Russia calls the Northern Sea Route, is, it's largely in Russian hands, but it does go through a choke point between the United States and Russia. It's not exactly a clear route by any means. It does ice over. There are several narrow passages which the Russians have to put icebreakers on. Ironically, the Russians just pushed through several vessels this fall through that route, and they advertised it. It was a big, huge event. They started moving in conjunction with the Chinese. Several vessels. Unfortunately, one of the vessels was the one that was identified as breaking the pipeline and the communications cable in the Baltic. So that kind of put again a bad light on what was happening there. But I do think there's some issues. Obviously, some nations are going to have a problem with this. They're going to sit there and say that the issue here is that the Russians are not fully in control. There's the potential to go through the Northwest Passage, which is Canada, but that route is not as well navigable as the Russian route.
Mhm.
So Russia has issues with it. You still need ice strengthened ships to do it, so there's not a lot of them out there. The other issue is environmental. A lot of shipping companies have announced they're not going to go that route no matter what because they don't want to be dumping emissions into the Arctic. But as ships develop newer propulsion systems and they become much more efficient and much less pollution, then it's an open door. So I do think that the Russians see this as an opportunity for them, and they're going to keep expanding on this. They keep pushing this route, and I think they're going to see a development. One of the things that's happened as a result of Russia-Ukraine war is Russia has become much more self-sufficient in moving its own cargo around. And so you've seen the growth of Russian ships. The Russian container liners, the Russian tankers are using this route a lot. And so I do think that eventually shipping companies are going to sit there and say, this route is, 3,000 miles shorter than what I need to go. I'm going to save a lot of money if I go this route. And so while the shipping companies will say they're not going to use it, eventually I think they're going to sit there and say, well, okay, this is going to be economical for us. We're going to start using it. So I think Russia's in a good position.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but the two observations that I see from this, from the big picture view of geopolitical interest here. First, Russia and China are literally outplaying the sanctions export import, uh, scheme by the West, and they're de-isolating themselves. They're actually attracting more opportunities, and they're making their own arrangements, and they're creating an alternative system, and they're becoming quite independent. So whatever the previous sanctions scheme and however previously it was structured and worked to isolate rogue activity, the same no longer applies. So some new vision of dealing with such actors needs to be um, planned. The other issue is, of course, um, the way the industry works. Normally it should help with the pragmatic terms of dealing with risks, but in actuality, and due to lack of a strong political response by US and others to these actors, it is giving advantage to the very countries that have the most motive to undermine it. Is there anything that can be reasonably done on these two fronts? Because we can't stop anyone from creating their own alliances and their own arrangements, but on the other hand, politically speaking, it's not good for the world order. It's not good for stability. It's certainly not good for to empower authoritarian and completely and aggressive regimes.
Well, unfortunately, the West, and particularly the United States, has been so focused on the Navy and the military aspect of shipping, they have really dropped the ball on the commercial side. The U.S. Navy and the Merchant Marine emerged from World War II, the biggest forces on the planet. And now the U.S. Merchant Marine is 21st in the world. China is the number one builder in the world. They build more ships than anybody else. They have developed port infrastructure around the planet. They have a lot of influence in ports and through Belt and Road and a variety of other methods. They really understood the application of sea power, what Alfred Thayer Mahan talked about, which was both the use of military and commercial shipping. Unfortunately, the U.S., Great Britain, and many other countries have lost that image. They really don't quite understand it. And so, in some ways, they've surrendered that to China. China operates some of the largest shipping lines in the world. COSCO, the Chinese Overseas Shipping Company, is one of the biggest shipping lines in the planet. Uh, they've been able to do everything from bulk cargo now with car carriers and bringing Teslas over. They've just really ingrained themselves against it. Chinese mariners are a growing group on the high seas. They're not poised yet, but we see their growth to the point that they may replace Filipinos as the most common mariner out there in the world. And again, once you have a system like China, you can't really sanction it. It's too big. It's too large. It has too much of an impact. And Russia can always get around sanctions by using China. And that's one of the things that we see is they can, what we're seeing with Russian oil is it's being exported on these dark fleet vessels. It's being shipped to China, it's being refined, and then sold back to the Europeans as diesel fuel or gasoline. So, at a profit for the Russians. So they're making money off this, and it's very hard when you see that the U.S. really lacks it. I would argue that what you saw with the U.S. military strikes against Yemen was a complete they didn't quite understand what they had to do to fix that situation. The military strikes were not going to fix it. And
Mhm.
instead, what you got now is a worse situation. And I think that goes back to the inherent fact that the military doesn't understand the commercial side of this, and we don't understand the soft power side. Russia understands it very well. They know how to apply soft power extremely well, and we're seeing that on a global scale.
One thing I've been hearing is rumors of Russia's interest in building a military base in Yemen. So if they get this commercial side right, they and Iran could establish and significantly expand their sea power capabilities and build a permanent presence in the area. And that will make it much more difficult for US and everyone else. So to round up the discussion, and I know we have to leave in a few minutes, what do you think is possible to do in the immediate short term as a response, and what needs to be done for a longer term, however long that is going to take?
Well, I think in the short term, I mean, to resume traffic through the Red Sea, to restore global trade to back where it was, obviously the Houthi are making the argument that as long as Israel's in Gaza, this is the issue. So, I mean, once we get Middle East peace, that solves the problem. Well, that's not going to happen anytime soon. I don't think. I think Israel and Gaza is a prolonged effort.
Mhm.
This is not going away sooner. Uh, Obviously the pressure point here is Iran. Who can exert pressure against Iran? The U.S. really can't. I mean, the U.S. is not in a position to do that. You just had Prime Minister Sunak of Great Britain announce that he wanted to do it. Great Britain may be in a better position to apply some pressure against this. The problem is Iran has gotten very much multidimensional here. I mean, they've attacked bases in Iraq, they've attacked Pakistan now. And the question is, how do you put for pressure against Iran to back off, have the Houthi back off? There was an argument that the shipping lines were going to pay off the Houthi. I don't think you can pay off the Houthi. I think the Houthi are very political. I think they are basically ideological. I don't think you pay them off with money. I think you can maybe leverage against the Iranians. But for right now, the Iranians see themselves in a very powerful position. They are, through their basically their client state through their proxy, they're really, Iran's been the subject of sanctions for a long time, and now all of a sudden they're making the West kind of howl a little bit in return. They've figured out how to apply some leverage, and it really goes back to dealing with the Iranians, which nobody wants to do because there's big fear about it. But the Chinese were able to broker, and that may be the weirdest one of all, is that maybe China's the broker here. And I think behind the scenes, the nation that's really playing and pulling strings more than anybody else is China right now. They seem to be doing it. They just brokered that deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. They can obviously apply pressure to Iran and the Houthis in a way that the U.S. can't.
That's
And
why
so
would they, if they're benefiting from it?
well, I think they benefit from it by furthering their influence around the
Hmm.
world. Everyone looks at everyone looks at China, excuse me, and says, well, they only have one base. It's in Djibouti. It's right there at the Red Sea. So Iran, China is not a big, huge military threat, but they don't have to be. If they get better protection for their ships by just identifying themselves as Chinese, then they don't need that. And so I think that further cements their control. Again, China is very dependent on imports and exports. They have to trade. This is their Achilles heel. They have become so integrated into the world economy that if it gets disrupted, they have a big problem. Now they've been storing resources and stockpiling for just in case that does happen someday. But they don't want it to happen. They really don't. That what they want to do is just become the kind of the monolith, this big, huge behemoth nation that once again a great power. They want to be the middle kingdom. They want to be everything centers around China. It's exactly what they want.
Hmm.
Every map of China has China dead center in the middle. And that's what they want you to remember. And so I don't think we get out of this in the short term. I think we're ahead for several more months because again, shipping can go around Africa, and so that's what's going to happen. But I do think that eventually, when Israel begins to back out of Gaza, they have to at some point. They can't continue. Netanyahu's got his issues, and then once there's pressure applied through Iran, however that is, then maybe you see it. The scary proponent is Iran pushes back even further.
Mm-hmm.
and you see more and more disruptions. And I don't think you see a direct U.S. Iran confrontation, but maybe it's Iran Pakistan, maybe it's Iran India, and that's the fear for me in this whole scenario is this is World War One. And it's the Balkan Wars of the 1912 and 1913, or the Ottoman, it's the Italian Ottoman War. It's all those little tiny wars that no one paid attention to until some archduke got shot, and then all of a sudden it blew up into everybody's face. That's the fear, that you're going to get a small regional conflict that blows up into a larger conflict between superpowers choosing sides: the EU, Great Britain, the United States, China, India. That's the fear, and it all happens right there in the Indian Ocean.
And I think it's very much heading in that direction. Everyone's comparing the current situation to World War II, but I am seeing World War One, both with the Russia's ambitions in the Middle East, very much a pre-Ottoman, anti-Ottoman kind of move to try to get control to the Gulf. Um, Seeing the Serbia, Bosnia tensions once again, South Korea, North Korea, and so forth. But what about the long-term, soft power, economic power? How do we rebuild that? How do we come back to primacy in that area?
Well, I think the U.S., Great Britain, all the nations, that's in their kind of sphere there, have to get better at doing that, and they have to realize it. We've gotten to the point where we tend to think military is the solution for everything, but the problem with military is they see every problem as a nail, and they're the hammer. And you got to get that out. You have to restore that order, and unfortunately that means devoting resources and assets to it. We've got to learn that there's an economic influence. People like money, they like seeing their standard of living come up. And the old analogy of Rome is the barbarians at the gate want to destroy Rome. It's like, no, they don't want to destroy Rome, they want to be Rome. And that's, everybody sees, what can they do to improve their lot in life. And that's it. I think for Iran, for example, it's normalcy, getting back to some sort of normalcy, not being a pariah nation as seen by through the United States for fear. That's very tough because the U.S. and Iran have a checkered relationship since 1979, and it really hasn't improved. Very difficult to do. I think the U.S. has to be looking at what China's doing, and China has been very effective because of the autocratic control of China. They're better at allocating funds. It takes us forever to get funds out of Congress. It's just because of the nature of a democracy and a bureaucracy for it to happen. But there are more things. Most countries around the world don't want to follow China socially. That's not what they want. They don't want to be like that. They want to be more like America. And so that's our biggest asset is the culture, is the society in some ways, even though it's not perfect by any means, and there's a lot of problems that we have to fix. You've got to learn how to use that soft power process, and we do it. But we don't do a good job in advertising it. Right now there's a U.S. Navy hospital ship sailing through the Pacific, helping islands in the South Pacific, the USNS Mercy. We don't advertise that. We don't talk about that. We don't do a good job. The Chinese are very good at telling you when they do something. They're extremely good at telling you when they do something, because unfortunately the U.S. Navy, for example, wants to talk about war fighting. They don't want to talk about their humanitarian aspects, which I think is really, really important. You have to do that. And so, and I also think we need to better educate our leaders with this. They don't understand. And it's not just our leaders who don't understand, it's the general public doesn't understand. They don't understand how dependent they are on those ships coming into ports and bringing goods. And it's not because US economy has just, manufacturing has collapsed. It hasn't. We're still a big, huge manufacturer. But we also benefit from having cheap goods and cheap products because we can buy other things. So a better understanding and education, I think, is always the thing. But I'm a history professor. I always talk about education. I always think that's the cure all for everything.
Thank you very much. This was fascinating, thought-provoking, and in some ways terrifying. But but I do think it's an important wake-up call, because I think most people are simply not even thinking about these aspects of the situation. I don't think they even know it. And if you don't know what you don't know, you can't start to solve the problem in any way. And I think that's where we're at right now. Thank you for everyone who's joined us. We'll be back again next Tuesday at 9 p.m. as usual, the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. Thanks for tuning in and have a great night.